In today's episode, we will once again see what's going on with the Q&E expansion update, watching the first turn of the Helix get completed, along with a number of lessons learned for next time, if there is a next time. And for those not interested in construction and expansion, a little extra at the end of the video, a motive power roster review. So let's remind ourselves where we were at the end of the last video. We had completed installation of the return loop at the bottom of the hidden staging level and the ladder and first few pieces of track in the 5-track Helix. A few short weeks later, here we are with the first turn of the Helix completed with roadbed and track installed for most of it. But looks can be deceiving. This is more of a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, with a lot of lessons learned that I should not have had to relearn. As I mentioned in the previous video, the Walther's Turnouts that I'm using have ties that are a thinner cross section than most other track manufacturers, and so I'm using evergreen 010 styrene sheet to shim the turnouts. There are 4 sheets to a package and you can make 3 shims for each sheet, so I'll have no trouble making enough shims for all of these turnouts, at least in the hidden section of the layout. I marked the location for the opening for the throw bar with a pencil from underneath the layout in the holes I previously drilled, and then using a sharp X-Acto cut these holes out and slid them under the turnouts, so quite an easy fix. Moving on to insulated rail joiners, this is one of those 1 step forward, 2 steps back kind of situation. Yes, I said that correctly. I know, cutting gaps are easy, but I wanted something clean and neat and have the ability to swap out a turnout wholly and completely if necessary in the future. So I went and found some high quality, I thought, rail joiners, and these are Picos that would fit code 83 track. The problem is these are designed for code 70 to code 83, meaning they would have the tightest fit on code 83s, and that turned out to be exactly the case. While I was able to get them to mate to the Walther's Turnouts with some difficulty, I couldn't for the life of me get them to get onto the Atlas Flex track. Slightly different cross section of rail. I just couldn't get it to go in fully and completely without really deforming and leaving a larger gap than I would have preferred. So here we are, back where we started, and using the Dremel cutting disc to create gaps in the rails. These are the only 2 turnouts that need it at the bottom end of the staging yard and loop tracks. The only other gaps will be at the top of the Helix. So effectively, the entire staging yard becomes a reversing loop where I can swap the polarity as trains arrive or depart. I used some bits of styrene to fill the gaps, and conveniently they could be welded to the styrene shim. So in the end it worked out. Not my prettiest work, but then again these are in the hidden staging area, so no one's really going to see them. And nevertheless I trimmed away as much excess styrene as I could. So now we can get back to laying some track. Rather than completely drawing the 5 track center lines throughout the Helix, I simply marked off where each track goes at 2 1/4 inch spacing, measured from the inside of the plywood sub-road bed. A tick every 3 or 4 inches is good enough for the cork to be able to follow the center line. I calculated that I'd need about 24 sections of cork to complete the next section of the Helix. And here you see the first half of the full circle turn with a bit hanging over on the edge, and the balance of the cork that I cut would be used for the second half of the full turn. Up to this point, I had used the full contents of the 25-piece box of flex track, so it was time to open up the second box. And here we see the track installed on the first half turn. Before continuing on with the second half of the full turn, which covers a section of track already installed, it's necessary to install some of the feeders because it'd be much more difficult to get in after the plywood sub-road bed is installed to do the soldering. It's been quite some time since I did wiring, and I was rummaging through my box of electrical odds and ends, and I thought I'd found the right wire to do feeders. And keep in mind, these wouldn't be very long, but these wires seem to me to be a little on the small side. According to my stripper, these wires appear to be 24 gauge, and I thought I had used at least a 22 gauge. In any case, I went shopping and found a nice roll of 20 gauge red and white wire. The slightly thicker gauge means that I could get away with slightly longer feeder wires to connect to the bus. That may not necessarily be required, but I'd like to have fewer connections to the bus, so I want to join up feeders that are close to each other before joining to the bus. This is an example of how I did it on the rest of the layout. My real reason for showing you this is that I needed to make sure that the positive and negative wires are the same in the new room as in the rest of the layout. Black will be red and white will be white. And so we move on to soldering and more lessons learned. Here is my original kit. A small variable wattage iron with a pointy tip, some flux, and some lead-free rosin core electrical solder. I figured if I'm starting a fresh project, I'll put in a new, fresh soldering tip. I use a bit of flux on the tips of the wires to tin them before doing the same to the area where I'm going to make the joint, and then applying heat to basically melt the two together. My first few attempts had way too much solder, and sometimes they looked like cold joints, like this one here. The first mistake I was making was having too much solder on the actual tip of the soldering iron, but eventually I got it to look like this. So lesson number one is always remember that the soldering iron is not to deliver solder, it's to transfer heat to areas that have already been tinned. I was a little bit worried that I had created some cold soldering joints here, 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 and here. So I thought, let me just test it before I layer on the next level of the Helix, which would make it difficult to get in here and resolder. So here's my test. I just pulled out a random Atlas locomotive, connected up the old throttle pack to this set of leads here. But I also thought at the same time I'd test the frogs on the Turnouts. These are the new Walters Turnouts. And sure enough, there really isn't a need to power the frogs, although it is possible because each of the Turnouts have a tab that you can attach a wire to and ultimately connect to a tortoise underneath. I have not had the need to do that on any of my Turnouts on the layout thus far, although all of the Turnouts have the ability to do that. So I'll probably go ahead and continue that in this section of the layout. Only as and where there appears to be a need will I connect up and power a frog, because it doesn't seem to be necessary. Trains move smoothly through them at slow speeds, and virtually all of the trains coming through here will be multiple unit lash-ups, so I don't expect to have any electrical problems through the Turnouts with those trains. Now, as I said, all of this is powered through one set of leads on the adjacent track. I'm going to, just to be doubly sure, connect to these leads and make sure that these joints are good solder joints. Lesson number 2 for soldering is always keep your tip clean. I had forgotten that one, so I ran out and bought some of this brass sponge to make sure I wipe off the tip after each joint. I also bought a small tin of that tip tinner you see on the screen. It allows you to recover oxidized tips and bring them back into shape. You can only do it so many times, but it's good to have on hand, especially if you don't have a spare tip. Lesson number 3 for soldering is wear a mask. Those fumes are deadly and they burn your eyes, and it's just bad all around. So after soldering for a few moments without the mask, I quickly dug it out of the closet and put it on. So with all those lessons under my belt, I got busy mass producing some leads, and got pretty good, I guess, at connecting these leads to the joints. I typically put feeders on every second joint, so there really is no opportunity for dead joints throughout the layout. After completing a bunch of these and tucking the wires into the pre-drilled holes, I thought, perhaps there's a better / faster way to do this. How about if I attach the leads to the joiners first from the underside, and then insert the joiners to the tracks? That's an idea. This method will come in handy when I'm wiring up the visible portion of the layout extension, and I don't want to see blobs of solder and leads next to the joints. The ballast will almost completely hide the tips of the leads. With the wiring out of the way for now, we got back to extending the plywood sub-road bed. Following the same process I used on the previous half turn of the Helix, I connected the two pieces with a nice wide sandwich plate, making sure that there are no bumps between the two, and then proceeded to mark off the height from the floor at each quarter point and 1/8 point turn of the Helix, so I knew how high to place the risers underneath. I continued this and went along installing the risers and screwing them in to the sub-road bed until I reached this point here. Oops. A little background information is necessary here so you understand the problem. I had chosen a 4-inch separation, top of rail to top of rail, for each turn of the Helix to maintain a reasonable grade on the innermost track of just over 2%, and the outermost track obviously less than 2%. This makes for a very tight clearance, but an acceptable clearance, allowing for 5/16 of an inch for the rail and cork, plus another 5/8 of an inch for the sub-road bed. You're left with 3 1/16 of an inch absolute clearance, which works out to 22 foot 2 inches in HO scale. That's enough to clear double stack containers, tri-levels, etc. By coincidence, it also means that I could use the 1x4s that I had purchased, whose actual width is 3 3/8 of an inch on their sides, to act as spacers between the two levels of plywood. The problem I ran into is that when I installed the riser at this location between the two pieces of plywood, the height from the top of the floor was much more than what I was expecting it should be. You see here 42 1/8 of an inch was the measurement, but in pencil you see I had marked 41 3/8. That's a huge difference. Something was wrong. And here you can see the actual effect of this. There's a localized, very steep section of grade that is not the same as everywhere else in the Helix. So I'd obviously made a mistake somewhere. So what went wrong? Well, I was so pleased with myself that choosing the 4-inch separation, top of rail to top of rail between the levels, meant that I could easily calculate the rise at the quarter points and half points of the helix. So 0 inches, a half inch, 1 inch, 1.5, 2 inches, all the way around to 4 inches. I was so pleased with myself that I didn't realize that I should have started here rather than here, because the helix effectively starts here where there's a track underneath. So what do you think the solution was? Yes, you guessed it. Deconstruction of a partially completed helix. Track, wiring, cork and all. Lucky for me, none of the risers were screwed to the plywood directly below joints in the track. And so by taking out a number of track nails, the flex track being very flexible and cork as well, I could easily find those few screws that were hidden underneath the track and cork. With the plywood sub roadbed now freed from the joists below, shims were inserted to slowly raise the level of the sub roadbed by up to half an inch in the first quarter turn of the helix. Beyond that point, all the other locations used risers. So all of the risers were unscrewed from the joists below, and they were then raised 1/2 inch to match all the way around. This meant that I didn't have to go looking for hidden screw locations underneath the track and cork roadbed anywhere other than in that first quarter turn of the helix. It's not perfect, but it'll do. You can see here that at the first point of contact between the two levels, this joist or riser is slightly less than the 3 3/8 inch that all the other ones are, but it still clears any cars that I'm likely to use. And note that the last two risers or spacers are placed halfway under the end of the plywood sub roadbed, so that the next piece or next half turn of the helix can be placed directly on top of it, and the joint will be supported by on both sides by the spacers. I'm still toying with the number of spacers that are required between the two levels. Right now I have them placed at the 1/8 mark of each turn of the helix. I think I'm going to have to add some more, but I want to have them as close as possible to the joist below so there's no sagging. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Q&NE expansion update. And now we move on to a motive power roster review. We're going to run through the rosters of both the Q&NE and Conrail, or at least those Conrail locomotives on the Q&NE. But first, I thought we'd run through a bit of history to explain how the Q&NE roster was developed. What you see here is a listing of all the locomotive types that we've had, both past and present, let's say from the end of the steam era till today. So you see a column for around 1960, around 1970, around 1980, and around 1990. Late 80s, 90s is kind of the era for the Q&NE as I'm modeling it. And you can see, like most small railroads in New England, there was at one point a mix of Alco, road switchers, and General Motors products. RS3s, RS11s, GP9s, very similar to what you find on the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central. But over time, the Alcos passed away or gave way to more modern General Motors replacements like GP38s and the occasional General Electric unit. In the case of the Q&NE, 4 B40-8s, much like the Susquehanna towards the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s. Perhaps more of those would have been purchased, but our clock kind of stops in 1990. So at the time our layout is in operation, there is the possibility that an Alco switcher might show up, maybe one RS3 sitting in a deadline somewhere or reactivated on occasion, and a couple of Jeeps still left, as you see running on the layout today. But mostly the power for mainline trains are the GP38s and GP38-2s. And you can see that the two GP38-2s that you may have seen on some of the videos are actually wreck replacements for number 76, 81, and 83, all of which were retired. What else can I say? We've got a variety of SW1500s, MV15DCs, MV15ACs for current switching power. I guess that's it. Let's get into the actual photos and descriptions of the models. The littlest locomotives on the Q&NE are the 3 SW1500s. These locomotives are first generation Athearn Genesis. These are fairly smooth runners, but I did add keep alives to all 3 of them because in the industrial zones where I have some Atlas diamonds, code 83 diamonds, they have plastic frogs, and they're just the right length that these short wheelbase locomotives would stall. So with the keep alives in, they run really, really well. The Q&NE specified Flexicoil trucks and full handrails for these locomotives, as they may pop out on the main for a local assignment. You may notice that none of these locomotives have horns, and that's because for some strange reason when you purchase undecorated locomotives from Athearn, even the Genesis lines, they give you lots and lots of detailed parts, but they give you no horns. And the answer I got back from them was, that's because, we don't know what you want to use. Meanwhile, they give you all kinds of other alternative parts for various details in the locomotive. So very strange. In any case, I have purchased horns for these locomotives. They just haven't been installed yet. The next model on our roster is the MP15DC. These are Atlas models, and these 3 here, numbers 20, 21, and 18, are the gold versions equipped with the QSI sound system. Not my favorite sound system. Someday I might change it out. I don't think it's very realistic in terms of the EMD sound for switchers. Regardless, they're probably the best running switcher locomotives I have. They are very, very smooth running. Q&E specified them with plows on either end. They already have the Blomberg truck, so they really are a very versatile locomotive. Like the Athearn Genesis locomotives though, the undecorated versions that I purchased did not come with horns. So like the SW1500s, I've got horns that I've yet to install. There are actually 4 units in this family, but the 4th unit, number 19, does not have sound. It's not sound equipped, but it runs in multiple unit consists with road units, as you see here, and runs fairly well because they're all Atlas locomotives. Someday it might get a sound system, but for now it's running quite happily with a lash up with 3 other GP38s. The newly rebuilt shops are not quite long enough to hold all three MP15s. You can see there's about 10 feet overhang of the last unit. One of the interesting comparisons between the Athearn and Atlas modern switcher profiles is how they treated the front radiator grills. On the Athearn SW1500, it's molded in place with the rest of the hood, whereas on Atlas, they molded the shutters and have a separate actual metal grill that snaps into place. I'm not sure which is best. The Atlas one allowed me to run the paint and decal across the shutters behind the grill, whereas the Athearn required me to really make a mess of the decals, poking holes in them to get that yellow line across. Not sure which is best. From the side-on view, you can see that the Q&NE specified these locomotives to have extra sanding capacity, which helps them with traction on slippery rails or grades. In the 1970s, Q&NE was looking around for more switching power to replace its aging fleet, and they came up with a plan to mate some MP15 ACs for yard service. Notice they have no plows, with the remaining GP9s that were still serviceable after some reconditioning. So here is one set, GP9 number 59 and MP15 AC number 22. These are both Athearn Genesis products, so they tend to run well together. The number 59 is equipped with sound, number 22 is not. And here is the other pair. This is GP9 number 64 and MP15 AC number 23. Both of these locomotives are equipped with sound. Interestingly, though, number 23 has the original MRC decoder, while number 64 has the Soundtrax OEM. Curiously, both decoders have had to be repaired by Athearn since I bought them many years ago. During this period, the Q&NE was also experimenting with a full-blown rebuild program. They only completed one, number 70, XGP9, converting it to an 1800 horsepower GP10. This is an Intermountain product. It runs very, very well, has lots of fancy lighting, programmable lighting, and sounds more like a truck than a diesel, but that may be because of the prime mover they used in the rebuilding program. Like the switchers, these Genesis units do not come with horns, but they came with lots of other detail parts. So I changed things up a little bit to make it look like they came from different production orders. Can you spot the difference? I've always loved how the Q&NE logo fits perfectly on the nose of the MP15 ACs. And here are just a few random close-up views of these locomotives. Like many of the smaller New England railroads, Boston and Maine, Maine Central, all of the Q&NE locomotives feature or lack the feature of dynamic brakes. This holds true for the GP9s and was carried through on the GP38 road units. And now let's take a look at some Q&NE road power. We've already seen one consist with 3 GP38s and an MP15 DC. Here's another pair of GP38s rolling into or adjacent to the diesel shop. There are in total 10 Atlas GP38s numbered from 73 to 85. There are 3 GP38s missing from that. The story goes that there was a derailment and 3 locomotives were damaged beyond repair. Those were numbers 76, 81, and 83, and they were traded in to General Motors to produce a pair of replacement units, and we'll see those in a moment. But first, here are all the GP38s on the layout. It's not often that you get to see all of them at the same time. And the newest locomotives on the Q&NE are the 4-8-40Bs that were originally purchased to work with Conrail on some pool intermodal trains, double stack container service. So you've seen on the layout before a pair of these locomotives in consist with Conrail -8-40Bs running an intermodal train run through on the layout. But one of the pairs is used in regular or general freight service as well. And finally, here is that pair of GP38-2s that were purchased to replace wrecked GP38s. They are obviously different than the GP38s in that they have the traditional late -2 radiator grills, but they also have a few other extras, switcher winterization cab windows, which are neat for using when in switching service, heavy switching service, when they're not out on the road. These locomotives are also fully equipped with sound, whereas all the GP38s are silent so far. And we can see here as well the other Q&NE non-revenue equipment here. There are 5 standard vision cabooses. These are all Atlas cabooses. You'll notice a couple of them still have their roof wax on. And the tail end of this consist is a transfer caboose that was kit bashed from an Athearn bay window caboose and an old AHM track cleaning car. So it's used for both transfer service and to clean track all across the layout. And here's one final photo of the entire Q&NE motive power fleet. You can see everything, even the nose of the MP15s and SW15s peeking up from inside the diesel shop. I don't think I've ever staged a photo like this. This is the roster of non-Quebec and New England motive power on the layout. It is almost all Conrail, save for the 2 SD40-2 locomotives, one for Norfolk Southern and one for Union Pacific, that you've seen many times in videos on the automobile train, run through power. On the 4-axle truck side of the ledger, we have GP40s, GP38s, U23Bs, and B23-7s. These are all Atlas locomotives, fairly good runners, no real issues with them. On the 6-axle side of the ledger, we've got a significant number of SD50s and SD60s. I really like the SD60s. They were, when they were brand new, I remember seeing them and taking lots of photos of them as they came into Montreal up from Syracuse, New York. Quite an imbalance though with General Electric locomotives, and that's only because until the recently announced C30-7s and C36-7s especially from Rapido, there wasn't a lot of pre-8 motive power. So consequently, I've got plenty of B40-8s and C40-8s, even a couple of wide cab units, which are really stretching the time frame for my layout, although the first batch of C40-8 Ws and the latest SD60s were, I think, delivered in 1989, 1990. So kind of fits the envelope, just pushing it a bit. Hoping that someday we'll see a C30-7A that will nicely round out the roster of Conrail power. Most of these locomotives have already been featured in recent videos. I think 2 videos ago I did one that mostly featured Conrail locomotives and trains. So I'm not going to be repeating that here. However, if there are any locomotives here that you haven't seen or I didn't feature, drop me a comment and I'll be sure to try and feature them in an upcoming video. Some of these locomotives, especially the late SD50s, the 6800 series SD50s, these are from an early Athearn run, post Blue Box, but not quite Genesis level, and they are not the best runners. At some point they may be retired. For now they're still in active service, or at least some of them are, but they need a bit of an upgrade. But all the other ones are in regular service, so if there's something you haven't seen or you'd like me to feature, just let me know. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoy layout improvement videos, here are a few others that you may find interesting. If you're not already a subscriber, you can click on the logo on the top right-hand corner of your screen.